They sold her the way people sold broken horses back then, quietly, quickly, with eyes turned away as if shame might be contagious. 18 years old, spine straight despite hunger, hands scarred from years of work that never belonged to her. The bill of sale was short, cruel in its simplicity, ink pressed into paper like a sentence already decided. No one asked her name. Names had a way of making things human, and humanity made business uncomfortable. The frontier didn't care that her mother died in winter or that her father disappeared chasing work that never came back. It only cared that she could cook, clean, work fields, and keep quiet. When the rancher stepped forward, dust clinging to his boots, no one expected him to buy her. He had 3 children already, widowed, overworked, known for keeping to himself. Men like that didn't take on burdens unless they had no other choice. The auctioneer hesitated, clearing his throat, as if offering a warning disguised as courtesy. But the rancher's voice cut through clean and firm. He named his price. Too high for a servant, too deliberate for a whim. The gavel came down, and just like that, her life was transferred from one silence to another. The ride to the ranch felt longer than it should have. The wagon creaked with every mile, the sun dragging itself across the sky as if even daylight was tired. She kept her eyes on her hands, fingers curled tight, expecting orders, expecting rules, expecting the familiar weight of fear to settle in. The rancher didn't speak much. When he did, it was practical things, how far they had left, when they'd stop for water. No threats, no lectures. That made it worse. Kindness, when you'd never been promised it, felt like a trick. When the ranch finally appeared, wide and lonely against the horizon, her stomach tightened. This was where her life would shrink down to chores and obedience. This was where youth ended. 3 children stood near the fence when they arrived, watching like wary animals. The oldest boy tried to look brave. The younger 2 stayed close together. She expected introductions that marked her place beneath them, instructions that made it clear she was owned. Instead, the rancher climbed down, turned to her, and said words that made her heart stumble. "You're safe here. No one will touch you without your say." The sentence hung in the air, strange and unbelievable. Safe was a word she'd only heard in stories meant for children luckier than her. That first night, she waited for the other shoe to drop. It didn't. She was given a room with a door that locked from the inside, clean sheets, a lamp. When supper came, she wasn't made to stand or serve. She was handed a plate and told to sit. The children watched her closely, unsure whether she was a threat or a gift. The rancher ate quietly, eyes tired but steady. She barely tasted the food, expecting at any moment to be told this was a test, that gratitude would be used against her later. But morning came, and with it work that felt fair, not endless, not punishing. He showed her the ranch, explained what needed doing, and then said something no one had ever said to her before. "If you don't know how, I'll teach you." The frontier was full of men who believed fear made workers efficient. He believed patience did. Word travels fast in empty places. Neighbors began to whisper, why buy a girl when he could have hired help cheaper? Why give her her own room? Why treat her like a person instead of property? The frontier didn't like questions that challenged the rules it survived on. She felt eyes on her when she went into town, felt judgment pressing like heat. She kept her head down, worked harder than required, waiting for punishment that never came. The children slowly softened. The youngest laughed around her. The middle child asked questions. The oldest watched the rancher, learning what kind of man he was becoming. And she began to realize something terrifying. She wasn't being prepared to serve. She was being prepared to stay. One evening, as the sun burned low and gold, the rancher sat across from her at the table and spoke carefully, like a man stepping onto thin ice. He told her why he'd bought her. Not because he needed help, not because he wanted control, but because he'd watched too many young girls disappear into worse fates. and he'd had the means to stop one. "You don't owe me anything, not work, not gratitude, not your future." Those words cracked something open inside her. For the first time, she cried where someone could see her. The frontier thrived on silence, but that night, inside a small ranch house, silence finally broke. The frontier didn't forgive men who broke its unwritten laws. Respect was built on hardness, on ownership, on knowing your place and making sure others knew theirs. When the rumors grew louder, they turned sharper. Men in town began to test him with jokes edged like knives, asked when he planned to collect what he paid for. He shut them down calmly at first, then firmly, then finally publicly. One afternoon, when laughter rolled too freely at the saloon, he stood and said words that would be repeated for years. She wasn't bought to be used, she was bought to be protected. Any man who thinks otherwise can step outside and explain himself. The room went quiet, not because he was the strongest man there, but because he was something rarer, unashamed. The frontier understood violence. It didn't understand decency backed by resolve. Life on the ranch continued, but tension clung to the air. She grew stronger, more confident, learning not just how to work, but how to decide. The rancher began paying her wages, insisting she keep the money. When she protested, confused, he reminded her she wasn't owned, she was employed, free. The children flourished in the stability he created. They learned that kindness wasn't weakness, that strength didn't need cruelty to prove itself. And slowly, the idea spread, like a quiet rebellion. Other ranchers noticed the productivity, the peace. Women noticed the safety. Whispers turned into questions, and questions into uncomfortable truths. The breaking point came when a neighboring rancher tried to claim her, citing frontier custom. He arrived with witnesses and paperwork stained by tradition. The confrontation happened in daylight, neighbors watching, waiting to see which version of the frontier would win. The rancher stood between her and the man, calm as stone. He tore the paper in half and said, "Custom doesn't outrank conscience." The silence afterwards was absolute. No gun was drawn, no fist thrown. And yet, something irreversible happened. The crowd saw a man choose what was right over what was easy, and they couldn't unsee it. From that day on, things shifted. Slowly, painfully, but they shifted. Girls stopped being sold so openly. Contracts were questioned. Men who once laughed began to look over their shoulders, not for violence, but for judgment. She eventually chose her own path, saving her wages, learning to read and write, discovering dreams she'd never been allowed to imagine. When she finally left the ranch, it wasn't because she was cast out, it was because she was ready. The children cried. The rancher hugged her like a father sending a daughter into the world. The frontier didn't applaud, it never did. But it listened, and sometimes silence is the loudest proof of change. Years later, stories would be told of a man who bought a girl and gave her freedom, of a choice that echoed farther than gunfire. And if you're still here, still listening, still believing stories can matter, then subscribe, because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who we can be, even when the world tells us otherwise.